Hi guys, welcome back to my Steps to Sobriety, my show on YouTube and as a podcast with me, your host, Stefan Neff. And I've got a fantastic interview. Yes, because A, it's a fantastic day, and B, it's a fantastic topic. It's a topic that is way out there. I've been honored and humbled in my life a few times when I came across people in my work who have had such severe trauma to their bodies that indeed their mind, their soul, or whatever we want to call it, decided to actually leave their body for a bit and have a little look around and think, well, that meat suit actually pretty much had it. So let's have a little look around. What I'm talking about are near-death experiences. And some of you might think, oh my God, he has lost it. He has seen the wrong TV shows far too many times. Yeah, the problem is there are so many patients who are seriously sick and who then describe something that is out there. And I'm fascinated about it. And everyone else out there, essentially, even if they find it corny, they are fascinated about it. That is what people believe. Is there an afterlife? Is all that? And so I thought I'd bring Gregory Shushan on board here today, because Gregory has made it his life mission. He is a historian of religion, and he's a man who has pretty much dedicated his life to examining what is out there. What are the themes that run through all these stories that are there around the world about something that comes after us, or something that is out there that is beyond what we can understand now. So this is going to be a very interesting experience for me today to talk to Gregory. So Gregory, welcome to my show.
Thanks, Stefan. That's quite a build-up. I hope I can live up to
it. Oh, you do, because like all of us, we have got a mission. We have got a mission, and that mission typically comes from trauma. That mission typically comes from a point where we had an aha moment, where we had a strange experience that didn't leave us alone. So from then on, we were compelled to do something. And that is sort of when you find your true self. For me, it was rehab, and then exploring a life that was so foreign to me, because it actually meant something. Integrity and self-love and authenticity, all these things actually truly are important and are core beliefs now in me. Where for near-death experiences, again, you wouldn't have just sort of woke up one day as a child and think, Mommy, you know what? I think I'm going to be a historian of religion, and I'm going to have a look a bit closer at near-death experiences. No, said no child ever. So what was your catalyst? What brought you into that topic?
Funnily enough, I did sort of as a child say.
You did? Okay, so I stand corrected. One child said that.
No, it wasn't exactly that. But I did always have an interest in, paranormal stuff. And I had books about strange phenomena and ghosts. And I had one collection of things like, had accounts of things like it would open up a stone that they found underground, and a live frog would be in it. It was thousands of years old, or a rain of blood in medieval Europe. All these just bizarre things. And in that, there was a small chapter on near-death experiences. And so all this stuff was weird and interesting, and I was a little bit skeptical even as a kid. But the stuff about ghosts and reincarnation, and especially near-death experiences, kind of fired my imagination. So that sort of planted the seed. And then my mom also was an influence, and I had an aunt who was an influence. My mom was, she did her research, her postgraduate research on William Blake and the psychedelic experience. And she, was interested in Aldous Huxley and perennial philosophy, of these ideas that, all religions of the world have the same common ideas to them. Carl Jung, collective unconscious, that kind of thing. And then I had an aunt who would give me books about wicchcraft and Rosicrucianism and all. So I had this, very strange kind of conditioning at an early age. So it was not really a personal traumatic sort of catalyst. Although thinking about it, having a somewhat difficult childhood with divorce and separation from parents and different forms of difficulties, I should say, it was a sort of escape, and it I think allowed me to think, okay, what is there beyond this present moment that gives the wider life and what I'm going through a deeper sort of meaning. What is there beyond this that I can potentially look forward to, or at least that gives it meaning beyond the present.
And whilst, of course, there is this thought that is our life is our life as we know it, and then when I die, there might be something else. I see it as something actually wider and bigger. If I had told my great-grandmother when she was young that one day she's going to put something that is called food, which actually is in plastic, and you put it into a box and you press a thing called a button, and then 3 minutes later it's going to be hot and cooked, she would have thought, I have eaten some really bad food and have got a bit of a poisoning. Nowadays, microwaves are absolutely normal for us.
Right.
So this is something that we have learned is out there, but we can't see it. So therefore, are there not other energy forms out there that we can perceive, that some of us are working on understanding better and getting more enlightened about, and therefore maybe can start working with it even before we die? So therefore, I think this is a continuum, and therefore I'm so intrigued to listen to you. So when there's one thing, most of us like spooky kind of stories. That's classic for children. I think I had my little collection there too of similar books, and even now, well, for crying out loud, what am I watching? Supernatural. I love, Sammy and Dean Winchester. Come on, yes. So even nowadays, I'm intrigued about the ghosts and all that here. So I'm just laughing about the coincidence. I didn't even click onto that here. But here we are. So we are all excited about it. But then you actually chose to go further. How did you go further, and why? What drove you? There's one thing of reading and dreaming and escaping reality, and then one thing to make it your profession.
Yeah, that's a good point. It was really a variety of things. For one thing, it is, it's an innately interesting subject. What happens to us when we die? It's one of the possibly the biggest question of being a human. Where did we come from? Where are we going? What happens when we die? Another one is, are we alone in the universe? If there's other intelligent life out there, whatever.
Exactly.
But it's, I guess what fired my imagination and my kind of intellectual curiosity was specifically about near-death experiences, was that people who, in case, some of the listeners or viewers don't know, near-death experiences happen when somebody apparently dies, or in many cases are actually declared clinically dead for a short period. And then they come back to life, or they revive, and then they tell about these experiences that happened supposedly in another world. They go through darkness, and then they come out into a bright light. They meet a being of light, deceased relatives. They have feelings of oneness and transcendence and peace. Then they reach a point that they can't pass, a barrier or a limit. And then they're told that they have to return, or sometimes they decide to return. Often they don't want to return. And when they do, they come back and they see their body lying there and think, oh God, I don't want to get into that horrible, cold, painful thing. And then they do. They have to, because either the medical technique has forced them to come back, or whatever process of being sent back makes them revive. And then they typically are transformed basically for the rest of their lives, where they've had a sort of spiritual transformation, and they consider themselves to be more generally, philanthropic and compassionate and kind, and just basically have this personality transformation. So, and what really intrigued me was reading accounts of this where people are saying very similar things in different parts of the world. And one of the catalysts was there was a book by a medieval English scholar named Carol Zaleski, and she wrote a book comparing medieval accounts of otherworld journeys from mostly Christian monks and nuns with near-death experiences. And so I thought, wow, it's not just modern people having them in 20th century Western cultures. This is going back to medieval times. So I kind of put that aside, that's interesting, but I have the other parts of my life to pursue, and I'm going to become an Egyptologist. So I was doing Egyptology degree at University College London, and we're reading texts like the Book of the Dead and the coffin texts and pyramid texts, and these are books that were intended to guide the soul of the deceased through the afterlife and essentially ensure that they have a good death and that they can overcome the perils and obstacles and become a sort of individuated, enlightened, divinized soul who lives with the sun god and becomes one with the god of the underworld. This kind of transcendent, all-encompassing experience. So I'm reading all this and I'm thinking, hang on, leaving the body, traveling through darkness, coming into a world of light, meeting a being of light, seeing the corpse, which in my interpretation, the soul of the dead is identified with the god Osiris, who is portrayed as a corpse in the underworld. So encountering that corpse is encountering your own corpse, and that enables you to realize that you're dead, yet still alive, and then to keep proceeding through the next stage in the afterlife and join the sun god and all that. And the sun god, of course, is a being of light. There's deceased relatives there. So I just started thinking, okay, there's not near-death experiences in ancient Egypt. There's no accounts of them, but it sure seems like their afterlife beliefs were, informed by knowledge of a near-death experience.
Intriguing to see the similarities in all these stories, isn't it? And it's equally, I mean, when you read about it, you can say, yeah, okay, someone had a little bit too much. They were writing here, right? But again, when you're talking about drugs, there are certainly the indigenous tribes around the world who are choosing to use certain mushrooms, certain plants, certain experiences that put their body into a trance to actually seek that, to actually go out there. And equally, when you look at such experiences, are they similar? If you were to speak to a young Indigenous American who has gone through such a manhood procedure, are they similar? Are these experiences similar to what you described?
They are, yeah. Not all the time, and it depends on the culture. I should back up a little bit and say, one of the main findings of my research has been that near-death experiences do occur apparently in all times and all places around the world, but that they are very culturally formed. So you're not going to have an example of a Buddhist in 10th century China seeing Jesus. That's just not going to happen. And by the same token, you're not going to have an evangelical Christian in Alabama seeing the Hindu god of the dead Yama.
Oh, beautiful. There's so many memes that come to my mind. Oh God, stop it. I'm a very cynical man, forgive me. No, but it is actually very true, isn't it? So the cultures, and that is what we superimpose, I guess, onto it. Because naturally, if you see light, you think, wow, what is that? And then you think your brain automatically tries to find an answer, or your soul tries to find an answer.
And if you were raised a Christian, then you're going to come back and you're going to say, I saw a light and it was Jesus and he was welcoming me. And if a researcher says, how do you know it was Jesus? They'll say, I just knew,
exactly.
Or it was the Buddha or whoever. And then the atheists are going to say, I saw the divine being of light and they're not going to give it a name. So, but they still saw this being of light that was radiating love and joy and acceptance and all that. So, but even with that, I mean, even just like a particular theme, like the being of light, that's not even universal in all near-death experiences. And this is one of the things that's kind of kept my interest going in it, is not just the similarities, but why are they so different? And how can they be so similar and so different at the same time? And
could you give us a spread? Because a spread of what is happening, because I certainly had guests on the show who have gone or who have had near-death experiences. And for them, it was, all of them was light as the center of their experience. Right. How they then reframed their belief system around it is a different story. But so are there other manifestations?
Sure. Yeah. Sometimes, you know, people will say, I'm thinking of, you mentioned Native American cultures. A lot of times there will be, they'll describe some kind of deity, which maybe they will give a name according to their own traditions, but they won't specifically say that it was radiating light. So whether that was just taken for granted, because maybe in their minds or in their culture, of course, the deity is radiating light. Maybe they just didn't see it as worth mentioning. But in other cases, people just meet a deceased relative and don't have the being of light. In some cases, they'll have a panoramic life review. Sometimes they won't. So it's really, the way I look at it is it's this, you know, repertoire of maybe 20, 25 different experience types that the mind or the soul or whatever draws from, depending on the individual. And there's been all kinds of speculation about, you know, is this because of the duration of the experience, the type of death, the type of trauma, how long the person was unconscious or temporarily dead. So there's still a lot of mysteries about, you know, what's going on with all this stuff.
Sure.
So a good example is only in small scale societies. So, you know, indigenous cultures in, you know, Native Americans, Pacific Africa, only in these cultures do we find examples of the soul walking along the path to the next world. In the accounts we're familiar with, you rise above the body and go through the tunnel into the brightness. So that's a really interesting example that seems to be not just based on specific cultures, but the type of social organization. So these small scale community societies walk along a road, and we don't. So, and then also another one is the reason for being sent back to your body can vary. So in a lot of Eastern cultures, it's a case of mistaken identity, where they'll say, you know, I'll go to the other world and I'll meet whatever divine being, and they'll say, actually, we got the wrong Gregory Shushan. we want the one who lives. You know,
that's a bit frustrating.
Forever. And they send me back, and then the other one dies. So, whereas in most, you know, NDEs, most of our, you know, your listeners and viewers will be familiar with, it's more often a case of the being of light sending the person back because, you know, they need to care for a loved one, or they didn't fulfill some goal or ambition that they had in their life, or they need to go and, you know, fulfill some kind of spiritual purpose. So that's a very different. So, you know, the return is the same. Being told to return is the same, but the reason of it is very different. So it raises a lot of questions.
Oh, exactly right. The question for me automatically is, if I am experiencing something that I automatically interpret as a as a transformation that now makes me more empathic and a better human being, that is actually a beautiful thing. If I was to experience something where someone has a lecture and said, oh shit, sorry, we made a mistake, go back, you're the wrong guy. I'm not sure that I take much sense out of that. What are the flow-on effects on the behavior of people that, let's say, for example, in the more Eastern cultures, is there a similar catalyst in behavior change noticeable?
That's a good question. Yeah. in most of the historical examples, it's really hard to figure that out. But I think it's implied because of the fact that usually there is some kind of positive message or positive outcome or a premonition of something that's going to happen that enhances the community's life or whatever in some sort of way. So which is another interesting thing, because even the positive transformation can be very culturally situated. But it does seem to almost always be something that's positive to benefit the self or benefit the community more often in kind of community-based societies. So for example, there's an example from Africa, I think one from a Native American one too, where the person was told to come back and tell those people to stop wife beating. Like, wife beating was no longer an acceptable practice. Wow. So it was before that, unfortunately. And then also to stop giving lots and lots of funerary offerings to souls of the dead, because they were wasting resources, because they're, sacrificing animals and burning it for the gods and the deities and the souls. And so the message was, don't do that anymore. Save your resources for the living, essentially. So,
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, so it's almost like whatever the community needs, and if the community doesn't need anything, because we're not so much of a community-based society, we're very much about the self and self-development. So it makes sense in a way that the positive message for people in a Western society is going to be about the self and how can you improve yourself, which in turn, hopefully would have a knock-on effect to improving the community. So.
Okay, I did not expect that. I wasn't aware of the different versions of near-death experiences out there. So you say there are 20, 25 different ones that are
different elements, that people draw from. Yeah, there's not 25 different typical near-death experiences. There's 25 whatever different sub-experiences that make up any given near-death experience. That's what I meant.
If 25 people were to go to the same party and you ask afterwards, those 25 people, one might have been in the kitchen and there was a couple who was extremely in love and gentle and beautiful and kissing each other. You would say, wow, this is a really lovely party. There was lots of love going on. Whilst another person was at the same party in the front and there was a fight going on. They would say, well, bloody well, that was an intense party. God, don't want to go there anymore. And alcohol is bad for you. So interesting. Both were at the same party. So I see that. We just don't.
Or even if you're in the same room in the same party.
Correct.
If you're in a bad mood, if you haven't had enough sleep, whatever it is, you can come back and say, God, that party was horrible and everybody was so boring and I just wanted to get the hell out of there. Whereas somebody else might have said, actually, I really connected with these people and I was in a great mood. And, so much has to do with, psychology and perspective and mood and all of that.
Which then begs the questions: are there different experiences described based upon the amount of suffering? Let's take two extremes. Let's say a very happy person that is involved in a very sudden, catastrophic motor vehicle accident and has a near-death experience, compared with, God forbid, a concentration camp inmate who has seen death and suffering and everything to the extreme as his daily bread. Are there any comparisons there?
I don't think there are. I don't think that specific kind of research has been done. It does remind me of a case from ancient Rome of two Christian martyrs, Perpetua and Sartorus. Perpetua became a saint later. And they were in a prison cell awaiting, being thrown to the lions in the Colosseum or whatever. And they'd been through lots of deprivation, extended periods of darkness and near starvation and all this stuff. And they apparently, first they had a few visions before they had an NDE, but then they had a joint NDE where they both died and they connected in the afterlife and saw each other there and came back to their bodies. But that was, I I mean, that was a joyous experience, and it was an escape from them, and it gave them hope. So it wasn't like the deprivations and horror they were suffering resulted in a negative experience. It was kind of just the contrary. So I would say the degree to which, psychology and mood and perspective impacts your NDE is maybe, I mean, I don't want to give anyone, ideas about this, but it might just be, your attitudes towards death, your level of fear. If you are, a very negative person who's going to be angry about leaving life, hostile to anything that's spiritual happening, who knows what, whatever kind of negative influence you might have on the experience, especially from a Tibetan Buddhist perspective, they would say that you very much, create this afterlife process as it's happening, and they kind of, encourage you to die consciously. And there's even forms of, dream yoga and things like this to practice what it's going to be like when you die. So you can do it with consciousness and peace, and help to steer the experience in a positive way.
Wow. Okay. I'm a man who tries to be prepared for all eventualities, but I have never considered that. Okay.
Yeah.
Damn. Mainly
but
because
just briefly going before you get too sidetracked, going back to your earlier question about shamanism.
Yeah.
That's another interesting point, because obviously shamanic experiences are going to vary between cultures. And so do the techniques of the shaman getting to the point where he or she travels into the next world, and is able to interact with spirit beings there. So, for example, some will take massive quantities of drugs. You said like psilocybin, psychedelics. Some will do sort of repetitive dancing and chanting to the point where they collapse. But the whole time the seed is planted in their minds that this is the intention of what they're going to do. So when they collapse, they know that they're going to leave their bodies and go to the other world. So it's partly what in ancient Greek they had practice dream incubation, where you would go sleep in a temple and cultivate a premonition dream from the gods. So it's sort of similar to that. In some cases, they would actually club themselves to death in order to bring about an NDE, or other kinds of processes that means they probably actually were genuine NDEs rather than a kind of facsimile or replication.
Goodness gracious! Okay, talk about playing with fire here.
Yeah. And part of the reason for doing this, by the way, was to rescue the soul of somebody who is in danger of death. So if there was somebody in the community who was dying, the shaman would leave the body and basically run after that person in spirit form and coax them back and heal their soul in order to bring them back to the body, which means that person wakes up and reports a near-death experience in which the shaman came and got them. So
wow.
Yeah.
I don't think that too many of these stories were repeated, because if you get so many hits on the head, I'm sorry, there is
that kind, yeah. Yeah.
But then again, these are very fundamental beliefs. This is coming from societies which are not distracted by their cell phones and which are not watching telly, and where life is very different, and where maybe existential questions are not a matter of Dr. Phil on television, but actually of sitting around a campfire at night and watching the stars and pondering what is life about, etc. So we are talking very, very different things. So whilst I shake my head in disbelief, I'm privileged to sit in a warm room here where there are no dangerous things around me, and where I don't have a subsistence living, where every day I might actually die due to either starvation or a wild animal or a tribe that doesn't like me. So it is we need to put that into perspective. And obviously, therefore, also the belief systems and the ways people went about trying to find solutions towards these existential questions.
Right. And the fact that another difference is that their knowledge, if you want to call it knowledge, rather than beliefs, is based on their experiences. So, none of us have the experience of, presumably none of us have the experience of, deliberately bringing about a shamanic journey to the other world, unless, maybe a few of us have done ayahuasca or ketamine or whatever. But that's not part of our, our experiential toolbox of knowledge.
True.
Whereas with them, that's just, that's what they do. There are certain members of society that's their job, essentially. So the places that they're getting their knowledge are very different from the places we get ours.
Very good. Very, very wise point. So if there is already such a connection with a world that maybe we don't understand, are near-death experiences more common in Indigenous people? Or is there any data out there?
I would say they're not. No, because the shamanic practices are, and they sort of make up for the lack of near-death experiences. In fact, in Australia, it's a really good example because amongst Aboriginal people there are very few near-death experiences that I could find that were not in a shamanic context. So it was almost like even when a near-death experience is reported, that person is considered a shaman by virtue of the fact that they had the experience. And so then they're able to do it repeatedly whenever they want to. So it was almost, the actual NDE was not even that relevant. It was more like the ability and the skill to be able to do that was the thing that was most important. I think because of the lack of medical technology, resuscitation technology in these different cultures, the experiences are actually not as common as they are currently. But it's interesting because with Native American examples, so I'll show you this. This is the book that I did this research in. It's called Near-Death Experiences in Indigenous Religions.
Yeah.
And that's comparing Native American, Pacific, and African accounts. Mostly, going back to the earliest sort of 16th century, going up to maybe 1930s or 40s. It's trying to focus on periods when they weren't totally converted to Christianity or Islam in the case of Africa. So in just the Native American examples alone, I found something like 70 near-death experiences or references to them from across the whole continent, which was, that's a lot. Just to put that in perspective, before I did this research, there was, maybe 8 or 10 NDEs in small-scale societies around the world that were even known. So I found 70 in just Native Americans. I found almost 40 in the Pacific. But then in Africa, across the entire continent, I found like maybe 8 or 12, I can't remember, but it was a very low number in comparison. So it wasn't so much that they're not happening in different cultures, but they're not being reported. And what I figured out was with Africa, as well as in Micronesia and to some extent in Australia, there were just sort of cultural restrictions on NDEs being reported. So, for example, in Africa, if somebody comes back from the dead, in Western modern culture, we're going to break down in tears of joy and say, "Oh my God, my beloved one came back to life," and we're going to embrace them and celebrate. And it's going to be like, if not a miracle, it's going to be an amazing, event. Yeah. Whereas in some of these cultures, the attitude was more like, that person was dead. Now they've stood up and they're walking around and they must be possessed. A sorcerer must have either brought them to life as a zombie or they're possessed by an evil spirit. Get the rocks, get the sticks.
That's right. Stephen King, Pet Cemetery.
Right, yeah. And there are a lot of examples of that I found that
interesting.
people who it was actually perilous to come back to life because you'd very likely be killed again or driven off into the forest or whatever.
Huh.
So there wasn't much context for even reporting a near-death experience, let alone for like,
Wow.
the reports of the person who had the near-death experience becoming part of the culture's afterlife beliefs and being seen as this wonderful spiritual kind of thing.
Damn, I didn't see that coming. But now that you spell it out, of course it makes sense, because we are so afraid, and we are so afraid of so much. And in a more, I don't want to call it primitive, but please forgive me for using the word, but let's call it a primitive tribe, where there are different belief systems. Yes, you can imagine that something like that is interpreted as something akin to hell and devil and whatever words those tribes would use to describe such an occurrence.
Yeah. Although even in, if you look at different kinds of psychical research and parapsychology, and there's accounts of poltergeists, and the Catholic Church believes in possession. So
yeah, okay.
There's so I think it's it might just be that because of those fears, they haven't opened up to other possibilities of what that return from death could be. But it's a really interesting because even within Africa, there's always exceptions that prove the rule. So a lot of Bantu societies, for example, their mythologies are more similar to near-death experiences. Their afterlife beliefs and myths. There are more accounts of near-death experiences, and their shamanic practices involve souls traveling to the other world. Whereas a lot of the other African cultures that don't have them, their shamanic practices are about, avoiding possession and evil spirits and this sort of thing. So it's this whole cultural complex of how they're received, and it's just, I think, depends on which path each culture takes, and which thing they decide to focus on. So I mean, Catholics, they they believe in possession and the devil and all this stuff, but near-death experiences haven't really been integrated into Catholicism either. Just as a kind of example, I don't know if the Pope has made any decrees about them or not. But it's, you don't really hear about it. Whereas in Mormonism, they have, Mormonism, NDEs are quite a, accepted, valid, important thing, because not only did a lot of their founders and early pioneers have NDEs, but it proves to them that, these experiences and, the world beyond and the kingdom of God and all that are available and accessible to all of us.
Which, of course, in the Mormon system has resulted in this strong sense of family, this strong sense of family research. So if you're a genealogist, one of the biggest databases you can tap into is from the Mormon Church with family search, which is beautiful. So there's a positive flow-on effect from this belief in the afterlife or in something out there that is bigger than us. So far, we have only talked about the very lovely and positive and good things about NDEs, but the way you're describing it, are there actually cases out there where NDEs have resulted in the opposite, in, for the lack of a better word, in evil coming out? Have people not turned empathic and more giving and more enlightened, but actually bitter to a degree that they now attack themselves, their loved ones, or society?
Well, there are some experiences themselves that they're quite rare compared to the positive ones that are negative, where people talk about, they just went into this, soup of amorphous darkness, and then there were, evil beings trying to drag them down and things like this. It's debatable about, what those mean. If they're hallucinatory, delusional kinds of things, or if they're, a genuine experience that person, for one reason or another, needed to have or had because of their actions or behaviors. or whether their psyche is creating it or what. We just don't really know. But in all of my research, I've come across very few negative ones cross-culturally, which is, I think, very interesting. But as far as negative transformations, I can't really think of any. I can think of some where the experience didn't lead to a positive one, but didn't necessarily lead to something negative. There's one from the 1930s of an American writer called William Dudley Pelley, and he aspired to be, in his own words, America's Hitler. And he was this, far-right, racist, reactionary, neo-Nazi. Well, not neo-Nazi, because he was contemporary with
exactly.
Nazis.
Exactly. Call him Nazi.
Yeah, Nazi. He was basically, and he claimed to have had a near-death experience that led to his enlightenment. And he wrote an article in some American magazine of the 1930s where he describes his whole NDE in great detail. And he says, he met the being of light and relatives and a lot of sort of typical features. From my opinion, it goes into a little bit too much detail to be credible. As soon as that starts happening, it seems like, okay, this is literary. He probably got this from Revelation. He probably got that from somewhere else.
Right.
So already the more elaborate, longer ones give me reason for pause. But he also was saying things like, basically that there's eugenics in the afterlife, and there's these kind of racial stratifications, and that white people are at the top, and blah blah blah. And it was after he had his NDE that his Nazi activities actually accelerated. And he started some school of Nazi
bullshit. No. Just the way you describe it, that is such a beautiful making sense of it. See, God told me that there is a racial system in which I'm supposed to be the head. Oh, right. Come on. There's right.
I don't think he actually had an NDE. I think he probably came across them in other literature. I mean, I should also clarify that the word near-death experience didn't even exist until 1975, the term. Raymond Moody, the American psychologist, who he's sort of credited with discovering them, and he gave them this name. But even so, they've been, kind of under the radar of, maybe spiritualist groups and theosophical groups, and, depending on the religion, different parts of the world, Buddhism has known about them for a long time. So I'm sure that, accounts of near-death experiences would have been available to William Dudley Pelley. He also might have seen how the power that religious experiences and NDEs could have in generating a movement and making himself out to be like a guru type figure. And it was after this he wrote lots of books and got followers. So
exactly,
that's the only example I can think of, and it could very likely be fake.
Very true. And sometimes people take such a journey to become more, I don't know, they can market themselves. It's essentially a marketing ploy. There is the interesting story about the founders of the AA, that Bill was actually not religious, and there's some evidence on that. Yet here he is, all about God, etc. What these guys figured out was a system how to get drunks dry. And so that is where the 12-step systems came in. But just to sell it like that, it's probably a bit hard. But if you now put a lot of God in, especially in the 1930s in the United States, suddenly that thing sells. So that was a very intriguing revelation when I did a bit of research into that, especially because I'm secular, I'm an atheist, so I don't really believe in a deity out there. So, but whatever you have to do to achieve a goal, especially if it is a good thing, then I think this is fair. that is what happened with the AA. That is what happening in my own life. I can change my language with a dying person at the drop of a hat, and it doesn't matter if this person is very religious. I can take on a religious persona, let me put it like that, to support this person in their last hours. That's I have no problem with that. Not necessarily that I believe in it, but it is that. So you're quite right. So when some people go onto their little soapbox and speaking loud out about NDEs, I can imagine that this is not often, that this could be rather to serve their own interests and their own manipulation. At the same token, I can imagine, I mean, I certainly had people on my show who were compelled to speak out, who were compelled to speak out about the positive experience they had. And one person was completely non-religious, and she spoke of light and some energy form out there. The other person became very religious, and she spoke of Jesus Christ. But the scheme was very much the same. So it's hard to say. So if someone is very outspoken and goes out there and it could very much be their own transformation, their own newfound purpose, mission. So it's hard to say, isn't it? So
I think in most cases it's probably likely both, because well, for one thing, in lots and lots of cross-cultural and historical accounts, the person comes back and says that they were told to bring knowledge of the afterlife to the people. And this is in fact where a lot of afterlife beliefs, especially in the small-scale indigenous societies, they actually came from. So a missionary or anthropologist or whatever would ask these people, what are your beliefs in the afterlife? And they'd tell them, and then they would say, how do you know? They say, so-and-so went there, came back and, told us what they saw. So this instruction to go back and, spread the news to the people is actually one of the cross-cultural, common elements of NDEs. So I think a lot of these, best-selling NDE authors, I do think they're genuine for the most part. But at the same time, if they can make a lot of money and get a lot of attention selling their books and doing that in the meantime, why not?
Exactly.
They're making a lot more money and getting a lot more attention than the researchers.
Yeah, I was about to say. So how many Porsches are you having in your driveway? Yeah, about that. Yeah, my Toyota Estima.
Yeah, I keep joking. I just wish I would have an NDE so then I could write about it from the perspective of, an experiencer and a researcher.
In the preamble of this show, before we started recording, we too said, no, actually, we are sort of deep down, we are still 25, and that our bodies are betraying us. I think we both have got a sense of our how precious life is, and that there is mortality waiting at the end. I'm not yet ready to confront that. I'm not yet ready to do some research in that. I'm still researching what I want to be, and more importantly, who I want to be when I grow up. Okay, so I'm still working on that.
Yeah, I hear that.
Oh, wow. So Gregory, wow, you have had a journey of decades of research, because that is obviously that caught you, that movement, that these existential questions caught you at a very early age. So here you are, and I've got actually goosebumps asking now, where are you going with that? I mean, what are you working on now? You are on a path in understanding these things that is light years ahead of anyone else. So where are you going now?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's near-death studies have been going on since 1975. I mentioned Raymond Moody, and but the cultural and cross-cultural and historical elements just kind of got pushed to the side along the way. Occasionally a researcher would come up with a few examples. There's an ancient Greek one called the myth of that Plato related, and they trot that out, and a couple of others, and say this means that NDEs are the same. But nobody really, zoomed in on this particular question very much. So I was able to, carve my niche in this way. And, and sometimes I think, oh my God, I've been studying this subject for, more than 20 years. Why am I not bored? And the reason is partly because of it's such a huge existential question. And also partly because I get to move from, ancient Egypt to China to India to, tribal societies around the world, and Victorian England, whatever. So that's been good. But and then with my recent book, in fact, I'll show you this, what the cover looks like. Does that work?
There it comes.
Yeah.
Oh, beautiful.
The
next world, extraordinary experiences of the afterlife. Gregory Shushan. Cool.
Yeah, that'll be out either by the end of this month or early April.
Nice.
And so this is, it partly overviews a lot of the stuff I've been talking about today with the ancient world and small scale societies and all that. But in my new book, The Next World, there's a chapter where I look at reincarnation memories. This is essentially children who remember past lives. But I'm not so much concerned with, the evidence of that they give about the past life and proving whether they're true or not. But what was interesting to me is some of these children remember the death of their previous personality. So, for example, they will say that the previous identity, they remember being hit by a car, and then their soul leaving the body and traveling to another world and meeting deceased relatives and a being of light, and etc. But then instead of being sent back to their old body, which is now dead, they're sent back into this new body in the present, where they're the child who's narrating, this experience that they had. So what's really interesting about that is those accounts correspond very clearly to near-death experiences. And there are examples from China and Japan and Burma, Sri Lanka, India, America, all over the place. So lots of Native American examples. So that was really interesting. I also looked at hypnotic regression cases where people claim to remember a past life during hypnosis and also remembered the state between lives, what would be like a near-death experience. And they're also similar, but they're so elaborated with so much, again, overly elaborate, lengthy detail about, Greek buildings and people in togas and libraries. And there's this kind of very highly systematized afterlife, which, to me doesn't really ring true. It's more like a sort of, 1940s fantasy or something.
Yeah.
And so whether those are just entirely fantasies or if there's, a germ of the actual experience that's genuine, but then, overlaid with a person's cultural background and beliefs, it's kind of hard to say. And I also look in that book at along the same lines at descriptions of the afterlife from mediums, who mostly from the Victorian and Edwardian periods, where spirits in the other world supposedly would transmit through mediums descriptions of what it's like there. And that was also very similar to the hypnosis cases, because very elaborated, a lot of stuff about, things that really mirrored Victorian or in Edwardian England. And in fact, to such an extent that there are quite a few descriptions of, it's just like England, but better. And then the next level up from there is even higher, a sort of more rarefied, idealized version, but it's also still England. And there's 7 layers of England, each one better than the next. So this is, the limits of the imagination, I guess, but it's also, they can't think of anything more ideal than the idealized version of what they already have. But
let me guess, in such cases, they never come back as the daughter of a of a rural farmer who is shoveling shit for the rest of her life. They come back as princesses. They come back in a noble. They have got servants, etc. Right. Is that an educated guess? And am I far off?
No, you're spot on. Yeah. Or if not some kind of princess, it's often some exotic, Native American or. But even then, it's a Native American princess.
Exactly right. Yeah, no, that always makes me laugh and makes me think. Okay, yeah, why are you telling me that? And what is really your agenda? So that is, I think that is where the cynic in me. I was a bullshitter, a big time bullshitter. So you can't bullshit a bullshitter. Okay, right. That's what we say in recovery as addicts. So no, I'm drawing a line there. But I would like to go back to one thing when you sort of think about other lives and the past, and some viewers might think you got to be joking. Here's a doctor listening to that dribble. The problem is in our direct past. It's not just that our ancestors have had experiences and that's it, and we have to recreate all of them. No, that's not true. There's a bit of a study where mice were in their cage and they were given electroshocks every single time that there was a cherry flavor was wafting through the cage. So they very quickly realized, no, you don't stand on that blade when cherry is wafting through the cage. So then rats did what rats do, and babies come around, and the babies were then put in a similar setup. And the moment the cherry flavor came, they stepped off the metal plate in no time, yet they had never received an electroshock.
Right.
So there you go. So genetically, experiences can be handed down. And we see that in the genetic link of needle phobia in my field, where indeed that is probably our ancestors 50,000 years ago. They figured out it's pretty good if you don't get stabbed. So if you don't get stabbed, you stay alive longer. So, so therefore, people with needle phobia I now consider as superheroes, because they were really bred out by their ancestors to say, so there is that. Me. So I can well, there you go. So I can live with that, having a genetic memory coming down. What is exotic for me, and maybe a bit more difficult to believe, is that there are memories that now leave a body and without genetic line, without genetic connection, come into a new body. That's then really where we come into the paranormal, where we come into the next step of belief. So there is no cellular connection. There is no connection that potentially I can explain as weird memories that are laid down in proteins in the brain. Are there any medical attempts to explain such things? Is there any brain research that potentially links those things up and makes them actually more plausible, more believable?
I don't believe there is, as far as there's good scientific research. There's at University of Virginia. There was a professor there of psychiatry, Ian Stevenson, and he wrote multiple volumes, Cases of the Reincarnation Type. Right. It was 4 volumes, and then European Cases of the Reincarnation Type. He devoted his life to this stuff, and he would meticulously research these cases. Or so, for example, if there's a child in India, he would go there and interview the family and the child and neighbors and relatives, and just really try to investigate every claim that this child made. Of course, he wasn't there when the child first started speaking. So there's always, one way or another that the case could have been, contaminated. But as far as, trying to trace memories of a past life into the brain of a current person, I don't think science has gotten there yet, because most scientists would say that's not even possible and we don't even believe it. So
Although, just go back to not so long ago in the United States, the CIA funded for 30 years a brain research program. And there's a beautiful TED Talk out there. I think the TED Talk that was banned in 2014 or something like that. And it's basically one of the astrophysicists. So hardcore brainy kind of people who were involved for decades in that kind of research. And it is very intriguing to listen to such talks by people who know, okay, they didn't have one too many or drugs or are maybe mentally unstable of sorts, however you want to label that. So there are people out there who have dedicated their lives to an understanding of things that we haven't yet got a grasp on. So, and I think it will be intriguing for my children and my grandchildren to watch this video down the line when new medical research has actually shown X and Y and Z, and suddenly we can link all those things together. We are just, in my belief system, we're not yet there. Just as much as we have, when was the first heart transplant? 1950s, when all those kind of things that you could suddenly keep a man alive. I mean, that is, who are you, playing God? Well, nowadays, you have a transplant. So what? Okay, get on with life. So, things are changing. Belief systems are changing. So I think we've only just started to scratch on the surface of those things out there. And then there are people like you who actually say, well, okay, let's take a scientific point of view and actually collate those stories, learn from them, compile the lessons, and give others, therefore, another step in the foundation where they can now step upon and can work with. So, Gregory, you're an amazing man, and you have done amazing research there. It will be intriguing for me to read your books. So it's amazing. If people want to learn more about you and find you out there, where can they find you?
I have a website, gregoryshushan.com, and I'm easy to find on all the other social media, Twitter, Facebook, whatever.
Beautiful.
My book is at whitecrowbooks.com. That's the publisher who's in the UK. And the book is actually on the front page now. I don't know if it will be by the time this goes out, but it'll be easy to find on there.
Fantastic. Guys, have a look down there into the description of the YouTube video and of the podcast, because you find all of Gregory's handles there. Gregory, thank you so much for such an amazing, in-depth look at near-death experiences. No ghost was harmed in the making of this interview. No, but it is weird because we were able to talk honestly and scientifically, and we are both men who are grounded, yet we are able to talk about such things, which is beautiful. There was not I believe and I know. There's not the kind of Bible kind of thing. No, there's no. Actually, there are things in this world that we don't understand, and why not talk honestly about it?
Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the main points to be made about near-death experiences is I'm not claiming to understand them, and I'm not claiming that they're genuine experiences of the afterlife, but I'm also not claiming that they're not. And every few months, it seems, there's a new article. Scientists have now explained near-death experiences, and they trot out the same argument that they've been making for 20, 30 years. It's the dying brain, it's anesthetics, it's lack of oxygen in the brain, all this stuff. And not a single one of them actually works. And part of the reason for that is because they don't take the cross-cultural differences into account. Because if it's the dying brain, they should be exactly the same for everybody, and they're just not. So my work kind of, it challenges both sides, because people who want to believe in an afterlife also want the afterlife to be the same for everybody. Whereas I don't have a problem with it being different, because as we talked about earlier, your example of the party, our lives are different. And if you think of how different our life is at the moment from, some tribal society in Malaysia or wherever, why would our afterlife be exactly the same? So
exactly. Oh, beautiful. Gregory, thank you so much for spending so much time with me, for answering my maybe strange questions. But it is, if we don't ask these questions, if we don't ask these questions, we will never learn. And it would be a sad day for me when I don't learn something new. So, Gregory, you're an amazing man. Thank you so much for being a part of my mission to make this world a little bit of a better place by simply talking about those things that people are a bit afraid to talk about. So no, it's cool. Thank you so much. And you guys out there, look after yourself, stay strong, whatever has happened to you. It's probably passing. All these emotions will go, will pass, good or bad. So hang in there, look after yourself, and live with passion. Dream on, dream on, dream on, dream it till